Welcome back, dear listener, to another soothing journey through time. It's so nice to have you here, resting and unwinding with a bit of gentle historical storytelling. Before we drift into the past, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. It's always such a pleasure to see the beautiful diversity of this sleepy little community. And if you're enjoying this soft-spoken style of history, do consider subscribing so you never miss a future tale to doze off to. Now let's begin our story, shall we? But slowly, gently, without hurry or haste. After all, we have nowhere to be but here, in each other's calming company, as I paint a picture of a time long ago and a journey fraught with hope and hardship in equal measure. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind wander back with me to the early 19th century and the great American frontier. In the 1840s, the American West exerted a magnetic pull on the imaginations of restless pioneers. The promise of a better life, of wide open spaces and untapped opportunity, shimmered like a mirage on the western horizon, tantalizing and just out of reach. For many, the siren song of this vast, uncharted expanse proved impossible to resist. They dreamed of fertile farmland, of a chance to start fresh and stake their claim on a patch of earth to call their own. And so, in what would become an iconic chapter of American history, intrepid settlers packed their lives into creaking covered wagons and set out to traverse the 2,000 grueling miles that separated the civilized East from the wild and untamed West. This was the Oregon Trail, a rough, rutted wagon route stretching from the banks of the Missouri River to the distant Willamette Valley. It was a path destined to be etched into the American psyche, conjuring images of white-topped wagons snaking across an endless sea of grass, of sun-bonneted women and weather-beaten men, of children running alongside the wagon wheels, of campfire tales under starlit skies. But beneath this romantic veneer lay a darker reality. One of the backbreaking labor, of sickness and sorrow, of dreams dashed and lives lost. The Oregon Trail, for all its allure, would demand an almost unimaginable toll. Imagine, if you will, the scene as a family prepares to embark on this epic odyssey. The air hums with a mix of excitement and trepidation as they take stock of their worldly possessions, agonizing over what to bring and what must be left behind. Each item is carefully considered, for space in the wagon is precious and the way ahead long and uncertain. Sacks of flour, coffee and sugar are loaded in next to cast iron skillets and Dutch ovens. Barrels of salted pork and dried fruit are wedged alongside coils of rope, shovels and spare wagon parts. Crates of heirloom seeds, prized quilts and family keepsakes are tucked into any remaining crannies, poignant reminders of the life being left behind. Outside, the oxen stamp and low, impatient to be off. The father gives the wagon a final once-over, checking the sturdiness of the wheels and axles, knowing that this humble vehicle will be their lifeline in the wilderness. The mother, fighting back tears, takes a last wistful look around the home she's poured her heart into, now echoing and empty. The children, too young to fully comprehend the enormity of the change ahead, clamber into the wagon box, their eyes wide with wonder at the adventure about to unfold. With a heavy heart and a trembling hand, the father grips the reins. The oxen lean into the traces, the wagon groans and creaks, and slowly, ponderously, the little family rolls out to join the stream of fellow travelers amassing on the trail. They are setting out on the journey of a lifetime, a leap of faith into the great unknown. Little can they imagine the trials and tribulations that await them on the far side of the horizon. As you listen to the sounds of the wagon wheels turning, the jangle of harnesses and the soft lowing of the oxen, let your mind drift with this hopeful little family as they bid farewell to the safe and the familiar. Their hearts full of dreams, for the new life they pray awaits them in the fabled land of Oregon. In the next part of our story, we'll follow in their wagon ruts as they make their way to Independence, Missouri, the bustling jumping-off point for the Oregon Trail. There, we'll meet the colorful cast of characters assembling for the grand exodus west and witness the final frenetic preparations before the wagons roll out onto the prairie. But for now, as we pause on the cusp of this great adventure, I invite you to let the soft cadence of my voice carry you into a restful slumber. There's no need to strain to stay awake. This story will be here waiting for you whenever you're ready to drift back into the past once more. So just let go, let your mind unwind, and allow yourself to slip into sweet, restoring sleep. Thank you, as always, for sharing this quiet space with me tonight. Until next time, I wish you the most pleasant of dreams. Leaving behind the relative safety and supplies of Fort Laramie, the pioneers set out across the high plains of Wyoming. The terrain here was rugged and unforgiving, a far cry from the lush river valleys many had called home back east. Sagebrush and prickly pear cactus dotted the landscape, broken up only by the occasional creek bed or lonely rock outcropping. The days took on a relentless rhythm as mile after desolate mile rolled by under the wagon wheels. Each morning, the women rose at dawn to stoke the campfires and prep a meager breakfast. There was no time to lose. They had to make as much distance as possible before the scorching midday sun made travel unbearable. While the oxen plodded ever westward, the pioneers walked alongside, eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for any landmark that might signal progress. Water, or lack thereof, became a constant concern. The creeks and streams they encountered were few and far between. Many were alarmed to find that the Platte River, which had been a lifeline up to this point, had dwindled into stagnant, undrinkable pools. Cholera, the dreaded scourge of the trail, lurked in the fetid water. Just a sip could fell even the hardiest pioneer within hours. Watching loved ones suffer the disease's agonizing symptoms was a terror that kept many awake at night. The livestock suffered greatly during this stretch as well. The oxen grew bony and weak on the scant forage. More than a few teams gave out entirely, leaving their wagons stranded in the wilderness. Watching a trusted animal collapse was a harsh blow. For many families, their oxen, mules, and milk cows were almost like part of the family, bearing them faithfully toward a new life. Losing one felt like an ill omen of what might still lay ahead. As they struggled through the waterless expanse, some pioneers couldn't help but wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Each day on the high plains seemed to bring a new trial, a new reason to despair. But they pressed on, mile after grueling mile, bound by grim necessity and a flicker of hope that something better waited beyond the western horizon. Among those clinging to this desperate hope was James Dougherty, a 37-year-old farmer from Illinois, traveling with his wife Sarah and their 4 young children. Like many on the trail, James and Sarah had been tantalized by reports of Oregon's fertile soil and booming opportunity. But now, 3 months into the trip, James was starting to doubt whether it had all been a lie. Sarah was sick, stricken by a summer complaint that left her doubled over with cramps. Without time to rest or recover, she could only clench her jaw and struggle alongside the wagon mile after mile. Their supplies were dwindling faster than James had planned for, and the empty wilderness seemed to stretch on forever. One evening, while Sarah lay shivering with fever, James took his 2 oldest boys aside. "Listen to me," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I need you to be strong, for your ma and the little ones. Can you do that?" The boys nodded solemnly, eyes wide. "There'll be hard days still ahead," James continued. "But we've got to keep moving, keep pushing for that new life. One day, God willing, we'll make a home out there. A place you can be proud of. It'll all be worth it. You'll see." As the light faded from the sky that night, James could only pray that his words would prove true. The family still had hundreds of hard miles ahead of them, across mountains and deserts and rushing rivers. The Oregon Trail's cruelest tests were still to come. All they could do was press on together, their hearts fixed on the chance for something better that shimmered on the far side of the horizon. The Daugherty's story was remarkable, but not unusual among the thousands of pioneers who braved the Oregon Trail. For many, this desolate stretch through the high plains of Wyoming was the first time the true scope of the undertaking hit home. The unforgiving landscape drove many to their physical and emotional limits. Each day demanded resilience and grit that some weren't sure they possessed. But still the wagons rolled ever westward, carrying these brave souls on a journey that would shape a nation. Through sickness and thirst, hardship and loss, they pressed on, mile after devastating mile, the yellow brick road to their own uncertain futures. The treacherous Snake River crossing was just the latest in a relentless onslaught of trials that had battered the pioneers for months on end. With each passing mile, their numbers had dwindled as families splintered off in sorrow and despair, turning back to bury their loved ones in lonely trailside graves. But for those who remained, a glimmer of hope flickered on the western horizon. The end of their 2,000-mile odyssey was finally within reach. The lush promised land of the Willamette Valley lay just beyond the rugged peaks of the Blue Mountains. As the exhausted wagon trains rolled out of Fort Boise, the mood was one of mounting excitement tinged with impatience. Gaunt faces creased with lines of hardship now turned upward to the clear skies, daring to dream that the worst was behind them. Surely, after the unforgiving desert of the Snake River Plain, the most merciful stretch of the journey was yet to come. Alas, the weary travelers had one last cruel twist of fate to endure. The trail soon steepened as it wound into the heavily forested Blue Mountains, where wagons creaked and groaned over boulders and fallen trees. Thick underbrush snagged at axles, while the hooves of oxen already weakened by snake bites slipped and stumbled on the rocky paths. To make matters worse, a band of natives who resented this intrusion on their ancestral hunting grounds shadowed the convoy from the cover of the woods. At night, their eerie cries pierced the darkness, spooking the livestock and fraying the nerves of women and children huddled in the wagons. Anxious men clutched their rifles and posted wary guard, catching mere snatches of fitful sleep. As the Blue Mountains loomed, tempers flared hotter than the July sun overhead. Bickering broke out as families grappled over whose turn it was to clear the trail or rein in a runaway cow. Patience, worn thin after months of forced togetherness, now snapped completely. Some pioneers simply refused to go on, abandoning their wagons where they stood to make their own way in this foreign land. But even amidst the strife and struggle, tender moments of connection shone through like glints of gold in a prospector's pan. An aged grandfather, face wizened as a pioneer buck, bounced a cooing babe on his knee as he spun tall tales of the wondrous new life that awaited. Young sweethearts stolen precious minutes together, gathering kindling, dreaming of the homestead they would build with their own hands. And so, they pressed on, this motley crew of dreamers united by grit and desperation, their fates now entwined like the dusty ruts left by their wagon wheels. With each mile, their legacy unfurled behind them, destined to become the stuff of fireside legends for generations to come. At long last, after 7 grueling days, the Blue Mountains released their stranglehold as the trail spilled out into the dense forests of the Columbia River Gorge. The cool mists that shrouded the towering fir trees felt like a balm on sun-baked skin, while the roar of the mighty river seemed to shout that journey's end was near. But the Columbia had one last test of gumption to pose. The only way down to the churning waters was a breakneck incline called Laurel Hill, steeper than a mansion staircase. With no other choice, the men laboriously disassembled the wagons, lowering them piece by precarious piece down the nearly vertical slope using ropes and pulleys. Woe to any wheel, crate or trunk that broke free. Like as not, it would never be seen again. From there, the final leg to the Willamette Valley could only be traversed by raft. Under leaden grey skies, the pioneers hastily lashed logs together, working against time and tide to carry themselves and their worldly possessions to safety. Many a cherished heirloom or hoarded supply was lost to the unforgiving current, swept away in the blink of an eye. But all of that was forgotten the moment their rafts went aground on the far shore of the Willamette River. As the haggard survivors clambered onto dry land, some sank to their knees in joyful prayer, while others wept and embraced, scarcely daring to believe their 2,000-mile trek was done at last. The Willamette Valley that greeted them was every bit the lush, promised land they had dreamed of during those long, cold nights on the plains. Burbling streams wound through rolling hills blanketed with swaying grass and wildflowers. Groves of oak and cottonwood offered sanctuary to deer, elk, and beaver. The rich soil seemed to shout with the promise of bountiful harvests to come. And yet, for all its abundance, this new Eden held its share of bittersweet endings. Families who had braved every hardship together now splintered off, staking claims in lonelier nooks and crannies of the valley. Covered wagons that had been mobile homes for half a year were put out to pasture, repurposed as storage sheds or chicken coops. Kin and comrades bid tearful goodbyes, uncertain if their paths would ever cross again in this still wild territory. Of course, the pioneers' trials and tribulations were far from over just because they'd reached their destination. Now the real challenges of starting over in an untamed land kicked into high gear, felling trees, ploughing virgin fields, raising cabins, warding off bears and cougar. Years of unrelenting, back-breaking toil still awaited before the first glimmers of civilized life would take hold. Even so, the sheer exultation of arriving in Oregon buoyed weary spirits and put an extra kick in trail-worn steps. As they gazed out over the verdant valley, the pioneers could see the future unfurling before them, ripe with possibilities. Schools, churches, and town squares would soon sprout, where only wilderness now reigned. But above all, Oregon held the promise of a legacy, the chance for people with nothing to their name to put down roots and build something lasting for generations to come. Whether they hailed from fine Boston townhouses or rugged Appalachian cabins, all could now claim a stake in taming this fertile corner of the continent. As the first sod was turned and the first log hewn, one could almost hear the echoes of the trials and triumphs of the Oregon Trail ringing through the ages. The 400,000 souls who braved that 2,000-mile crucible over a quarter century had carved out more than just a route. They had shaped an enduring American spirit of courage and resilience. In wagon ruts carved into the land from Missouri to Oregon, in faded names etched on lonely gravestones, in yellowed letters and leather-bound journals, the epic saga of the Oregon Trail still speaks to us across the generations. It is a testament to the power of hope in the face of adversity, a reminder that even the most impossible seeming of dreams can be made real with enough grit, gumption, and determination. And so we remember the brave pioneers who risked it all to chase a brighter future, in the strength of communities that rose from prairie soil, in the fortitude of those who tamed an untouched land, and above all, in the quiet moments of remembrance for the many who sacrificed so much along the way. Though their days were often full of sorrow, their legacy is one of unshakable faith and love. Love for their families, love for their country, and love for the land that called them ever westward. May we never forget the courage of these humble heroes who built a nation one wagon wheel revolution at a time. The end of the Oregon Trail was only the beginning of a story still being written in the heart of every American dreamer. A story of a promised land where anyone willing to take the leap of faith can stake a claim on a better tomorrow. The epic journey lives on in the eternal hope for a new frontier, just over the western horizon. We left off with an intrepid band of pioneers, the Donner Party, setting off from the soggy banks of the Blue River in desperate hopes of reaching the fabled Willamette Valley before winter's icy talons could ensnare them in the mountains. George Donner, the party's 60-year-old patriarch, was a prosperous Illinois farmer who dreamt of fertile soil and financial security in the West, a vision that had tantalized him into selling his land and sinking his life savings into this audacious gamble. His brother Jacob, a stout and steady wagon maker, was the pragmatic anchor to George's impetuous optimism. Together with their families, they led a group of 87 men, women and children, an unlikely assortment of dreamers and drifters, united by little more than a common yearning for a better life beyond the horizon. As they rolled out from the Blue River camp that muggy July morning, their wagons heavy with provisions and weighed down further still by the leaden uncertainty of the untamed wilderness ahead, George Donner could scarcely imagine the trials that awaited them. The initial days gifted them a deceptively gentle passage, the oxen plodding across well-worn trails that snaked lazily through the plush Nebraska grasslands. Children scampered gaily alongside the caravan, plucking wildflowers and marveling at the exotic creatures of the plains. The majestic herds of buffalo that darkened the horizon, the skittish pronghorn antelopes that bounded away at the wagon's approach, the comical little prairie dogs that popped from their burrows to survey the curious procession. In the evenings, fiddlers and dancers would emerge to enliven the camp with an air of festivity, the melodies drifting across the swaying prairie grass as the sun dipped beneath the vast western sky. But as the days ticked by and the landscape began to change, so too did the mood among the pioneers. The Donner's route veered away from the established Oregon Trail, instead following a newly promoted shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff that promised to shave hundreds of miles off the journey. Leaving behind the tried-and-true trail felt to many like cutting the tether to civilization itself. The terrain soon turned unforgiving, the wagon wheels bogging down in deep sand and scraping across jagged rocks that splintered axles and shattered wheels. Water and forage grew scarce, the withering heat of the high desert sapping the strength of people and animals alike. Tempers flared as the Donners fell behind the main body of pioneers, their laboriously slow progress stoking resentments among those forced to wait for them. In the blistering crucible of the Salt Lake Desert, the Donner Party began to come apart at the seams. Livestock collapsed from thirst and exhaustion. Wagons had to be abandoned. Some families splintered off, desperate to make their own way to California. Through it all, George Donner maintained his dogged optimism, cajoling and reassuring his increasingly fractious flock. By the time they reached the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains, it was already October. An early blizzard had blanketed the peaks, turning the rocky slopes into a treacherous sheet of ice and snow. The Donners faced a terrible quandary: wait out the winter in the mountains with their few remaining cattle, and hope they could survive for months on meager rations, or press on and pray they could beat the next blizzard to the safety of the Sacramento Valley. Fatefully, the Donners chose to wait, reasoning that surely this first snowfall was a freak occurrence, and that the way would soon clear. They set up camp next to a picturesque alpine lake, hunkering down in ramshackle cabins and rickety lean-tos, little imagining that this scenic but unforgiving spot would soon become synonymous with one of the most harrowing ordeals of the pioneer era. As the October days shortened and the air turned to a pervasive, biting chill, the true severity of their plight became inescapably clear. The cattle, left to forage in the frigid meadow, grew gaunt and feeble. The pines yielded little game. The party's food stores dwindled to a few mouthfuls of boiled ox hide a day. The spectre of starvation crept into the camp, hovering over the emaciated families huddled beneath tattered buffalo robes in their dark, smoky hovels. It was a fate almost too chilling to contemplate, to come all this way, to uproot homes and risk everything, only to be frozen in this icy purgatory mere days from journey's end. As the blizzards raged and the food supplies emptied, the Donners sunk deeper into despair, their hopes slowly suffocating beneath the smothering snows. George Donner tried to rally his enfeebled companions with all his old charisma, but his words rang hollow, swallowed up by the gnawing void in their bellies and the looming dread of what lay ahead. By Christmas, the first of the party had succumbed to hypothermia and malnourishment. More would follow in the weeks to come, their bodies laid out in the snow, stripped of their flesh by the ravenous survivors, the very last resort of the desperately starving. When a relief party from California finally battled its way through the towering snowdrifts to the camp in February, it was greeted by a scene of Gothic horror. Gaunt, spectral figures with sunken eyes and tattered rags huddled around the pitiful remains of their comrades, looking more dead than alive. Of the 87 souls who'd begun the journey with such high hopes, only 48 staggered out from the camp that had become a frozen tomb for the rest. George Donner himself would not be among them. Bedridden and delirious, his frostbitten limbs ravaged by gangrene, he had urged his wife and children to leave him behind, to save themselves while they still had the strength. Racked with anguish, but knowing it was the only hope for her family, Tamsen Donner tearfully bid her husband a final farewell and set off into the blinding white wilderness, carrying her smallest daughter on her back. It was an end almost too heart-wrenching to contemplate. This man who had been the very picture of vitality and confidence, left to perish alone at the utmost extremity of the world, his dreams shattered, his name forever shadowed by tragedy. And yet in his last moments, as he gazed out at those majestic, merciless peaks with his fading sight, perhaps some small solace could be taken in knowing his sacrifice had bought his loved ones a chance at survival, that his life had been given for theirs on this brutal final passage to the promised land. The Donner Party's ordeal stands as a grim testament to the perils and costs of the westward migration. For every triumphant arrival in the fertile valleys of Oregon and California, there were dozens waylaid by disaster, felled by disease, shattered by accidents, broken by the unremitting toil and hardship of the trail. And yet still they came, year after year, these ordinary men and women galvanized by little more than grit and blind faith, chasing that eternal siren song of the frontier, that tantalizing promise of freedom and self-determination, dangling just beyond the far horizon. In their struggles, their small victories and crushing defeats, their joys and agonies, and all too human foibles, they carved the enduring myth of the American West, as much as they carved the ruts of the great overland trails. Today, we remember them not just for the miles they logged between the Missouri and the Pacific, but for the miles they logged in the soul of a young nation, propelling it forward, for good or ill, with each turn of a wagon wheel, each step into an unknown future. In the end, their legacy was not so much a trail to a new land, as a new understanding of the sheer indomitable force of the human spirit. And though the long sun-baked road they trod has long since faded back into the earth from which it sprang, the imprint they left on that grand communal odyssey we call the American experience shall never be extinguished. So let us pause for a moment, you and I, to pay quiet tribute to these emigrants of yesteryear, all those hopeful souls who dared to strike out for a distant promised land, guided by little more than the stars and their own unshakable belief in a better tomorrow. As we drift now into the welcome embrace of sleep, let our dreams wander back to a time when the West was still a vast and daunting mystery, and a journey of 2,000 miles began with that first fateful step. Good night, dear listener. May your wagon find smooth passage to whichever far horizon beckons. However arduous the journey, I have no doubt you will find your way by and by to that fine and fertile valley of your dreams. Till then, rest easy, take your comfort where you can, and believe, as the pioneers did, that a new day's dawn is never far away. A young boy, no more than 6 or 7, carefully steadies a stick against the side of his father's wagon wheel. With his tongue poking out in concentration, he uses his precious knife to whittle a point on the end, determined to craft a miniature version of the weapons he's seen the men carrying. At last, satisfied with his work, he scampers off to slash at the tall prairie grass, lost in an imaginary battle against natives and bandits. But his innocent game is short-lived. His mother's sharp call pierces the air, summoning him back to the small mountain of mending that needs doing, the little ones that need tending. With a sigh, the boy shoves his toy weapon through his belt and trudges back through the swaying grass. Such was life for the children of the trail. Brief bursts of play snatched between endless chores and responsibilities thrust upon them by necessity. Childhood was a flickering luxury, gone all too soon. Indeed, life on the Oregon Trail spared no one its harsh realities, not even the youngest pioneers. From the moment their families rolled out of independence, children were expected to shoulder their share of the back-breaking labor required to survive the 2,000-mile journey. No one was dead weight on the trail. Everyone pulled their weight, no matter how small. Young boys quickly learned to handle livestock, mend harnesses, gather firewood, and hunt small game to supplement the wagon's food stores. Little girls, some as young as 4 or 5, took on a heavy burden of domestic work, cooking, cleaning, washing, and looking after the infants and toddlers too small to help. Rarely did they have a moment to rest, let alone play. Even more heart-rending were the children that never made it to Oregon at all. The trail was a deadly place, and the young were some of its most vulnerable victims. Disease, accidents, and exhaustion cut short thousands of small lives over the trail's 25-year history. Many bereaved parents had no choice but to bury their little ones in shallow graves alongside the trail and press on, leaving dreams of a future together in the dust behind them. Perhaps saddest of all were the young ones orphaned by the journey, their parents and older siblings claimed by cholera or mishap. These most unfortunate children were often left with other wagon trains or unceremoniously deposited at forts along the way, their fates uncertain. Some were lucky enough to be taken in by other pioneer families, while others were left to fend for themselves or sent to distant orphanages back east. The trail's legacy for these children was a cruel mix of trauma, displacement, and loss. But somehow, through all the hardship and sorrow, many children of the trail endured. They grew up fast and tough, aged beyond their years by the rigors of the journey. By the time they reached Oregon, most were hardly recognizable as the fresh-faced youngsters who had left Missouri behind. The trail had stolen their innocence, but gifted them with tenacity and grit they'd carry for the rest of their lives. In later years, many would look back on their pioneering childhoods with complicated emotions. Grief for lost loved ones and trials endured, but also pride in their family's strength and accomplishment. They were living legacies of the Oregon Trail, their very existence a testament to the fortitude of the human spirit. And as they watched their own children and grandchildren grow up in the fertile Willamette Valley, perhaps they found solace in knowing that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Such were the hard truths of life, death, and childhood on the Oregon Trail. It was a place that took so much, but also gave birth to a generation tempered by adversity and shaped by perseverance. In the end, the children of the trail embodied the paradox at the heart of the pioneer experience, that sometimes it is only through great loss and struggle that the most meaningful triumphs are won. And as we remember these smallest pioneers, let us honor both their suffering and their strength. For in the face of all the trail took from them, they managed to carry the most precious cargo of all the long way to Oregon, the hope and resilience of youth unbroken against all odds. May their stories endure as long as the ruts their wagons carved into the earth, a testament to the dauntless spirit of the young in a land as harsh as it was beautiful. With each passing mile, the once robust herds of oxen, mules, and horses grew gaunter and weaker, their ribs jutting through hides stretched tight over angular frames. And no wonder, for the dry, dusty, and all too often barren land along the Platte River yielded little nourishment for the beasts, yet demanded more work from them than ever before. The Platte River Road was a cruel twist of geography, a roughly 500-mile-long stretch of the trail that snaked along the eponymous river from western Nebraska all the way to Wyoming. Its proximity to the water source seemed a blessing at first, a constant companion for the parched and thirsty emigrants. But they soon learned the deception of the wide, shallow Platte, so choked with silt and sand that its waters were all but undrinkable, heavy and thick as a bad gravy. And so the pioneers, their throats dry and gritty from the alkali dust that billowed with each step, had no choice but to press on, rationing their precious water stores even as the river taunted them with its useless abundance. They could only watch, stomachs growling, as their livestock attempted to graze the scanty vegetation along the banks, worn down to stubble by the thousands of animals that had passed before. The worst was yet to come. As the wagons rolled ever further west along the Platte, the terrain grew drier, harsher, more unforgiving. The relentless sun beat down on the treeless plain, searing away the last traces of moisture. Soon, even the hardy prairie grasses withered to brittle wisps. With nothing left to eat, the once sturdy beasts began to falter. Their legs buckled beneath them, unable to pull the heavy wagons another step. Many sank to their knees and could not rise again, their huge eyes glazed with pain and exhaustion. The pioneers had no choice but to heave them to the side of the trail and put them out of their misery, the sharp report of a rifle replacing the plodding rhythm of hooves. It was a wrenching decision, but a necessary one. On the Platte River Road, only the strong survived. The loss of each animal was a blow, both emotional and practical. For many families, their livestock were not just beasts of burden, but beloved companions, as much a part of the group as any human. To leave them behind in a lonely grave was a cruel necessity that tore at even the toughest pioneer's heart. But perhaps even more devastating was the knowledge that each fallen ox or horse left the wagon train that much more vulnerable. With fewer animals to pull the heavy loads, the remaining beasts had to strain even harder, wearing out faster. A vicious cycle began. More animals lost, more strain on the survivors, more suffering and loss. It was all the pioneers could do to limp along, watching their power ebb with each passing mile. The wagons themselves began to show the strain, toiling across the parched and rugged land along the Platte. Wheels cracked and splintered under the punishing conditions. Iron rims came loose. Axles snapped like matchsticks. At times, it seemed the dry road might claim more wagons than the rushing rivers that came before. Desperate pioneers cannibalized what they could from the broken-down wagons they passed, littering the trailside like wounded soldiers after a battle. They harvested whatever parts could help them cobble their own rigs together for a few more miles. But there was only so much that ingenuity and grit could do in the face of the unrelenting wasteland. Many wagons simply had to be abandoned, left like desiccated skeletons picked clean by the elements and other passers-by. Through it all, the determined emigrants soldiered on as best they could, leaning into the yokes themselves when the animals could pull no more, pushing and pulling with all their might to keep the wagons rolling. But the Platte River Road stretched on and on, each mile more punishing than the last, sapping their strength and their spirits. To be continued. Part 4. The Great Plains. As the wagon trains rolled westward, the pioneers found themselves traversing the vast, seemingly endless expanse known as the Great Plains. This was a land of extremes, blistering hot in the summer sun, yet bone-chillingly cold come nightfall. The monotony of the landscape was staggering. mile after mile of flat, barren grasslands stretching out to the horizon in every direction. It's hard for us to imagine today, in an age of air-conditioned cars speeding down smooth superhighways, just how punishing this leg of the journey could be. The wagons crawled along at a sluggish 15 miles on a good day, every bump and rut in the trail jarring the passengers and cargo within. Men walked alongside, leading the oxen and horses, baked by the relentless sun. Women and children huddled in the shade of the wagons, trying to escape the heat and choking dust. There was a crushing amount of labor required just to keep moving forward. Hunting for game to supplement dwindling food stores, gathering buffalo dung to fuel the cooking fires when wood was scarce, the constant cycle of packing and unpacking the wagon at dawn and dusk, wheels and axles that needed repairing, livestock to be tended, 100 other chores that left little time for rest. It's no wonder many pioneers' diaries from this leg of the trip strike a weary, discouraged tone. And then there were the sudden thunderstorms that would sweep in from nowhere, pummeling the wagon train with sheets of rain and hail. The only choice was to hunker down and wait it out, huddled together in the meager shelter of the wagons, hoping it would pass quickly. More than one canvas wagon top was torn to tatters by the gale force winds. The plains presented other hazards too, rattlesnakes lurking in the tall grass, waiting to strike the unwary, swarms of mosquitoes that descended at dusk to torment the pioneers and drive the livestock to distraction. And of course, injuries and accidents were a daily risk with so much heavy labor to be done. A broken bone or serious cut could spell disaster, with the nearest doctor often weeks of hard travel away. Amid the hardships of trail life on the Great Plains, the women shouldered an especially heavy burden. Their workload was immense, cooking what meals they could over open fires, mending clothes, caring for children, tending the sick, all while enduring the same physical hardships as the men. A stoic resilience was required just to face each grinding day. Margaret Reed, traveling with her husband and 4 young children, captures the exhaustion in her trail diary. "This is the most dismal day we have had, cloudy with the wind blowing and every appearance of rain. All day the wind was cold, and all were out of humour." On top of the dreary weather and biting cold, the Reed's wagon had broken down the previous day, making for slow going on the trail. For Margaret and countless other pioneer women, keeping the family clothed and fed was a Herculean task in the isolation of the plains. She goes on to write, "Williams killed a buffalo and brought it in tonight, but it was too late to get any good of it. Supper on short rations for many." Dressing game and cooking over a smoky fire was grueling work after a long day in the wagon, even if the men were successful on the hunt. Despite the backbreaking labor and daily hardships, Margaret and women like her found the strength to keep going, mile after dusty mile. There was no turning back now, with so much distance already behind them. All they could do was press onward, eyes fixed on the horizon, holding tight to their dreams of the verdant lands that awaited at journey's end. But crossing the Great Plains was only the beginning. Even greater trials lay ahead as the wagon trains approached the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Ahead lay towering granite peaks and plunging river gorges that would test these pioneers' courage like never before. Part 5. Buffalo and Native American Encounters. As the wagon trains pressed on across the Great Plains, 2 very different encounters would leave indelible impressions on the pioneers. Sightings of the awe-inspiring buffalo herds and tense, wary interactions with Native American tribes. For many emigrants from the East, the first sight of the vast buffalo herds that roamed the plains was almost beyond belief. Massive herds numbering in the hundreds of thousands would stretch across the horizon, grazing as far as the eye could see. Imagine the astonishment of seeing these majestic, shaggy beasts up close for the first time, after only having heard tales of them. One emigrant, Sally Hester, marveled in her diary, "I never could have imagined such a sight. The whole country was black with them as far as I could reach. It was so wonderful that I could scarcely believe my eyes." The amazement soon gave way to an almost reckless frenzy of hunting among the pioneers. Fresh meat was so coveted after weeks of dry rations that wagon trains would grind to a complete halt at the sight of a herd, the men snatching up their rifles and chasing after the stampeding buffalo with wild abandon. In their zeal to take down as many animals as possible, hunting parties would dangerously stray for miles away from the safety of the wagon camps. This insatiable appetite for buffalo meat and hides had a devastating impact on the herds. An estimated 25 million bison roamed the Great Plains in the early 1800s. By the end of the century, unchecked hunting by pioneers, settlers, and professional hunters had driven them to the brink of extinction, with only a few hundred left. It was an ecological catastrophe that forever altered the landscape and native way of life on the plains. Speaking of the Native Americans who called the Great Plains and surrounding regions home, the first encounters between pioneers and tribes like the Pawnee, Cheyenne, and Sioux were often fraught with tension and misunderstanding. Emigrants, with their herds of livestock and heavy wagons, tromped straight through tribal hunting grounds and delicately balanced ecosystems. Language barriers and cultural differences made communication difficult, leading to a general atmosphere of unease and mistrust. While some encounters were peaceful, with goods being traded back and forth, others escalated into armed standoffs or skirmishes. One particularly tragic misunderstanding occurred near the Platte River in Nebraska in 1846. An old Sioux chief named Eagle Head approached a wagon train to trade for tobacco. In his nervousness at approaching the wagon, Eagle Head kept one hand concealed under his blanket. The suspicious pioneers shouted at him to show his hand, which he didn't understand. In the tense confusion, someone opened fire, shooting Eagle Head dead on the spot. It was a needless act of violence born out of fear and miscommunication. While Eagle Head's death didn't result in immediate retaliation, it sowed seeds of resentment between the Sioux and the emigrants that would only deepen in the years to come. As the wagon trains rolled on, leaving scattered buffalo carcasses and bewildered tribes in their wake, many pioneers paused to reflect uneasily on the impact their journey was having on this once pristine wilderness and its native inhabitants. The irony couldn't have been lost on some, that in their quest for land and a better way of life, they were uprooting others from the lands they'd called home for generations. These sobering thoughts added to the general air of melancholy as the long wagon trains approached the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. The optimism of the early trail days had faded, replaced by a grim determination to see the journey through, no matter the hardships that lay ahead. The mountains loomed like an imposing granite wall on the horizon, one that would take every ounce of strength and perseverance to conquer in the weeks ahead. As the pioneers reached the Blue Mountains, the final stretch of their arduous journey, a palpable sense of excitement and impatience began to mount. The end was so tantalizingly near, they could practically taste it. For months, they had dreamed of this promised land called Oregon, with its fertile soil and temperate climate, a place where they could finally put down roots and start anew, leaving behind the hardships of the trail like a bad dream. But the Blue Mountains would not let them pass so easily. The steep, rugged terrain posed yet another formidable challenge for the weary wagon trains. The narrow, winding paths carved precariously into the mountainsides, with sheer drops on one side and unyielding rock faces on the other. A single misstep could spell disaster for both wagon and pioneer alike. The exhausted oxen strained with every ounce of their depleted strength to pull the heavy wagons up the relentless inclines. The emigrants had to pause frequently to let the animals rest and to shore up the tattered, precarious wheels and axles of their wagons. Every setback, every delay was met with groans of frustration. They were so close to their goal, they could nearly grasp it. Yet the mountains seemed determined to thwart them at every turn. But they had not come this far to let a few hills stand in their way. With gritted teeth and sweat-drenched brows, the pioneers pressed onward and upward. Inch by painstaking inch, they scaled the daunting peaks of the Blue Mountains. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed, chapping their faces and numbing their limbs. But still, they persevered, spurred on by the tantalizing promise of the lush green valley that awaited them on the other side. As they crested the final summit and looked out over the majestic vista below, an electric thrill raced through the wagon train. The mighty Columbia River Gorge stretched out before them, a sight more beautiful than their trail-weary eyes could have ever imagined. Craggy cliff faces soaring heavenward, wreathed in wisps of fog. Cascading waterfalls plunging down to the churning rapids far below. Lush forest slopes of fir and spruce, so green they almost hurt to look at. It was a view that made every mile of hardship worth it. Suddenly, the trials of the trail began to fall away, replaced by an almost euphoric elation. Whoops of joy and laughter rang out among the pioneers, their spirits buoyed by the knowledge that their new home lay just beyond this breathtaking gorge. Wives embraced their husbands, children danced with glee. Tears of relief and gratitude flowed freely down sun-weathered cheeks. But as awe-inspiring as this landscape was, it held its own brand of danger. To reach the valley floor and their final destination, the wagon trains would have to traverse the treacherous Columbia River itself. And this was no placid, easygoing waterway. The Columbia raged and frothed with dizzying speed, its surface broken by jagged outcroppings of rock that lurked just beneath the swirling eddies. For the scores of wagons, this last trial would be a deadly game of chance. With few options available, most of the men set about hastily felling logs and lashing them together into makeshift rafts. It was a risky and time-consuming endeavour, but it was the only way to ferry their wagons and supplies safely across the turbulent water. Some of the bolder young men, flush with the eagerness of journey's end and yearning to make a name for themselves, took a more daring approach. Unwilling to wait for the cumbersome rafts, they built lightweight boats from animal hide stretched over wooden frames. These cockle shells, barely more than glorified canoes, were never intended for whitewater rapids, but the impetuous young pioneers would not be dissuaded. With their hearts in their throats, wives and mothers watched as these brave and foolhardy souls cast themselves upon the mercy of the raging Columbia. The frail crafts bobbed and spun like corks in the frothing current, tossed about by the relentless dips and swells. One moment, the boats would crest a towering wave and hang suspended. The next, they would plunge into the watery abyss, vanishing from sight. It was all the men could do to keep their vessels upright and pointed downstream, paddling with every ounce of strength and skill they possessed. Miraculously, most of these daredevil voyagers managed to reach the far shore intact, if not a little worse for wear. Dragging themselves onto the rocky banks, they let out triumphant whoops and hollers, exulting in their own audacity and nerve. They were the first to set foot in the Willamette Valley, and they would have quite the tale to tell around future campfires. For the rest of the pioneers, the crossing was a slower, but no less harrowing affair. Clinging to the logs of their makeshift rafts, they gazed down wide-eyed at the surging maelstrom, mere inches below their feet. The river roared in their ears, drowning out all other sound. Spray from the frothing rapids lashed their faces and drenched their clothes. A single slip, one wrong move, could plunge them into the unforgiving torrent, never to be seen again. But by grace or sheer grit, wagon after wagon made it safely across the Columbia's watery gauntlet. As the last wheels rolled up onto dry land, an almost disbelieving silence fell over the pioneers. They had done it. They had actually done it. Over 2,000 miles of unforgiving wilderness, every imaginable hardship and privation, and now here they stood, on the threshold of their new lives. The valley of their dreams lay before them, achingly close now, lush and green and full of promise. As the wagon train rolled down from the bluffs and into the welcoming embrace of the Willamette Valley, the sheer magnitude of their accomplishment began to sink in. The Oregon Trail, that great artery of American migration, had delivered them to this Eden of the West, a place where their dreams of a better life could finally take root and flourish. But even in this moment of elation, a bittersweet undercurrent tempered the pioneers' joy. Reaching Oregon had exacted a heavy toll, one counted in shallow graves and shattered hopes strewn across the vast expanse of the trail. In the faces of the emigrants you could see the spectres of all those they had loved and lost along the way, all the broken wheels and lame oxen, every hungry night and every gut-wrenching fear. The Oregon Trail had indelibly shaped these men and women, tempering them in the forges of adversity and heartache. Now, as they stood on the cusp of their new lives, the pioneers couldn't help but marvel at the vagaries of fate that had brought them to this lush, promised land. What strange and potent alchemy had transformed those first wistful whisperings of Oregon, heard in cramped cabins back east, into the living, breathing reality that now stretched out before them? How thin, they wondered, was the line between triumph and tragedy on a journey of this magnitude? No one knew for certain what the future would hold, here in this raw and untamed wilderness. The spectre of hardship still loomed. Building new homes and communities from scratch would be no easy feat. There were forests to fell, fields to plough, food to coax from the rich but unfamiliar soil. And beyond the borders of the valley, an entire continent of possibilities and perils beckoned, from sea to shining sea. But for now, as the sun dipped low over the forested hills and painted the vast Oregon sky in dazzling pinks and golds, the pioneers let themselves savor this hard-won moment of triumph. They gazed out over their valley, the promised land they had sacrificed so much to reach, and felt the first tentative stirrings of belonging. Here, 1,000 miles from everything they had ever known, these trailblazers dared to imagine that they might finally make a home. Their wagon ruts stretched out behind them, carved into the rich black earth as far as the eye could see. A testament to the indomitable spirit that had carried them through the crucible of the Oregon Trail, forging the very bedrock of the American character. And though the hardships were far from over, the pioneers now faced them with the knowledge that they had stared down the worst this vast continent could throw at them, and emerged triumphant on the other side. As darkness fell over the Willamette Valley, the bone-weary emigrants closed their eyes and let the soft sounds of the new land lull them to a dreamless sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, as all tomorrows do. But for tonight, cradled in the emerald embrace of Oregon, they slept the sleep of the victorious. The Oregon Trail had yielded its hard-won prize at last. After the celebratory rush of arriving in the Willamette Valley had worn off, the newly minted Oregonians found themselves facing the stark realities of starting over in an unfamiliar land. With their rickety wagons finally at rest and their weary oxen put out to pasture, it was time to build a new life from the ground up. For most pioneers, the provisions that remained after their arduous journey were meager at best. The once full barrels and sacks had slowly dwindled down to crumbs over the long months on the trail. Treasured heirlooms and furniture, deemed too burdensome to carry, had been cast aside along the way, littering the trail behind them like a breadcrumb path of abandoned memories. They stood now in this lush valley with little more than the tattered clothes on their backs, a few head of livestock, and whatever tools and supplies managed to weather the punishing 2,000-mile journey intact. With no general stores or settlements to speak of, these early Oregonians had to rely on their own ingenuity and resourcefulness to get by. The first order of business was putting a roof over their heads. Fortunately, The Willamette Valley's abundant forest provided ample timber for building. Using crude hand saws and axes, men would work together to fell towering Douglas firs and shape them into sturdy logs for cabin walls. Women and children would mix clay and straw to fill the chinks between logs, creating a rustic but snug shelter from the elements. Of course, constructing a cabin was only half the battle. With no corner grocers or bustling markets to be found, pioneers had to quickly learn how to eke sustenance from this strange new land. Hunting and fishing provided much-needed protein, with elk, deer, and salmon proving both plentiful and delicious. But a diet of wild game alone could not sustain a growing community. Turning their attention to the rich soil beneath their feet, Oregon's new residents began the back-breaking work of creating farms and gardens from scratch. Plows, having been too heavy and unwieldy to carry in the wagons, were often fashioned from the curved roots of oak trees. Dragged behind a sturdy mule or ox, these rudimentary plows would break up the fertile ground, preparing it for precious seeds brought all the way from Missouri. Wheat, corn, and potatoes were among the first crops sown, promising a bountiful harvest to fill hungry bellies. But as any farmer knows, a crop is only as good as the hands that tend it. From sunup to sundown, pioneers could be found bent over their neat rows of sprouting plants, pulling weeds, shooing away pests, and carefully irrigating from nearby streams. It was a far cry from the bustling city lives many had known back east. But there was a certain peace and pride to be found in coaxing sustenance from the earth with one's own two hands. As the seasons changed and the first crops were brought in, the Willamette Valley began to transform from a wild frontier to a burgeoning agricultural community. Neighbors came together to share in the harvest, trading bushels of wheat for barrels of apples or sacks of potatoes. What had once been a motley collection of strangers thrown together by the trials of the trail now began to resemble something like a true village, bound by the common threads of hard work, self-sufficiency, and an unshakable determination to succeed in this new land. But even as life took on a semblance of normalcy and routine, the spectre of the Oregon Trail still loomed large in the hearts and minds of these pioneers. The memories of those harrowing river crossings, the loved ones lost to cholera and snake bites, the sheer grit and resilience it took to walk 2,000 miles into the unknown. These were not easily forgotten. The trail had shaped them, tested them, and ultimately delivered them to this new life. But the scars it left behind would last a lifetime. Perhaps that is why, even as the years went on and the Willamette Valley grew into a thriving hub of commerce and culture, the pioneers never lost their sense of pride and kinship with one another. They had endured the unimaginable together, and that bond could never be broken. When they gathered around communal fires to swap stories and songs, the tales of the Oregon Trail were always the most requested. The younger generation would listen in rapt attention as their elders recounted the perils and triumphs of that epic journey, their eyes growing wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. In many ways, the Oregon Trail never really ended for those who traveled it. It lived on in the calluses of their hands, the aches in their joints, the bittersweet memories of all they had gained and lost along the way. And as the wagon ruts slowly faded back into the earth, overgrown with wildflowers and tall grasses, the legacy of the trail endured in the hearts and minds of the people who had braved its challenges. Today, the Oregon Trail is remembered as a defining moment in American history, a testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. The pioneers who traveled its rugged path were ordinary people with extraordinary dreams, willing to risk everything for the chance at a better life. Their stories continue to inspire and humble us, reminding us of the incredible feats that can be accomplished through sheer grit and determination. In a world where we can cross the country in a matter of hours, it's easy to forget the monumental challenges our ancestors faced in settling this vast land. The Oregon Trail stands as a powerful reminder of the sacrifices and struggles that shaped our nation, and the indomitable spirit that has always defined the American people. As we lay our heads down to sleep tonight, let us spare a thought for those brave pioneers who came before us. Their legacy lives on in the cities and towns they founded, the farms and orchards they planted, and the enduring spirit of resilience and determination they bequeath to us all. And though the Oregon Trail may be but a memory now, its impact on our history and our national character will endure for generations to come. So let us close our eyes and drift off to sleep, content in the knowledge that we are the heirs to a rich and remarkable history. A history of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, who faced the unknown with courage and conviction, and who forever changed the course of a nation. The Oregon Trail may have been brutal, but it was also a testament to the best of what makes us human. Our capacity for hope, for perseverance, and for dreaming of a better tomorrow, no matter how arduous the journey may be. Imagine yourself pacing back and forth on the muddy banks of the Snake River, heart racing as the icy water roars past, a seemingly impassable barrier after months of grueling travel across the continent. It's late summer in 1847, and your wagon train has trekked over 1,500 miles through sun-scorched prairies, treacherous mountain passes, and desolate deserts to reach this point. But now, staring down at the swirling rapids, the Oregon Trail's greatest test looms large. Crossing the Snake was the most perilous river passage on the entire Oregon Trail, claiming countless lives over the years. Even for the staunchest pioneers, it demanded respect, careful planning, and precise execution. On your journey thus far, you've already witnessed the trail's deadly toll: shallow roadside graves, abandoned possessions, shattered wagon wheels embedded in the dirt. Each one a reminder of how precarious life is out here on the frontier's edge. As you size up the Snake's fast-moving current, your mind races with the grim stories passed between wagon trains. The Evans family, who lost their wagon and youngest daughter when the river pulled them under just last week. The Robinsons, forced to leave behind a wagon of precious heirlooms when a raft capsized mid-channel. Each tale seems more chilling than the last. But you have no choice. The lush promise of the Willamette Valley lies just beyond this final hurdle. You must get your family across to complete this harrowing odyssey you began months ago with so much hope in your hearts. It's a risk, yes, but a necessary one. And really, what part of the Oregon Trail journey hasn't been a perilous, high-stakes gamble? So you gather your wits, your courage, and hold your loved ones close. Together with your fellow pioneers, it's time to build the rafts that will either ferry you to your new life in Oregon, or, heaven forbid, doom you to a watery end in the unforgiving Snake. With a deep breath, you wade into the shallows to begin the fateful crossing. The process of fording the Snake was a complex feat of frontier engineering and raw determination. First, the wagon train's strongest men would volunteer to swim to the other side of the river, battling the current with ropes clenched between their teeth. These became the lifelines that would guide the rafts across. Once secured, the ropes were strung across the channel, connecting the banks. Then the real work began. One by one, wagons were dismantled, their frames and wheels lashed to sturdy logs felled from the riverbank. Atop these primitive rafts, the pioneers would carefully load their most precious cargo: tools, food stores, and of course, their wide-eyed children, who couldn't help but stare in frightened awe at the frothing water below. With white knuckles and a whispered prayer, the patriarch of each family would then grasp the guiding rope, pushing off from solid ground into the Snake's unrelenting flow. Hand over hand, they'd pull themselves across the channel, while those on shore watched in suspense, ready to spring into action if the raft showed any sign of capsizing. It was a slow, nerve-wracking process, one that could take an entire day and night, to ferry the full party to the other side. Imagine the relief as your raft finally scrapes against the far shore, as your trembling legs take their first steps on dry land. Tears and embraces mingle with the cries of livestock as the crossing's toll settles in the deepening twilight. You've made it, battered but unbroken. However, the trail has one final test of spirit in store. In the grim light of dawn, a distressing scene takes shape. Several wagons lay half submerged in the shallows, their once pristine white canvases now a sodden grey. Pots, pans, and a child's ragdoll bob in the eddies. Most heart-wrenching of all are the unmistakable lumps of motionless oxen and pioneers, forever claimed by the unforgiving current. For long minutes, the snaking line of wagons is utterly silent, save for the eerie creak of wet wood and leather. It's as if even the wind itself is giving a moment of reverence for the lives lost in the night. You bow your head, a shaky breath escaping as you contemplate the narrowness of your own survival. But as the sun crests the horizon, a murmur begins to ripple through the wagon train. Slowly, painfully, the survivors stir back to life, mechanically beginning the now familiar routine of breaking camp, repacking supplies and rehitching teams. For a tragedy on the trail, no matter how gutting, does not grant the luxury of time to grieve. The Willamette Valley is close, achingly close, and winter waits for no one. The fallen will be mourned, but the journey must go on. So as the train lurches back into motion, you spare a final glance at the glittering waters of the Snake, at once beautiful and terrible. In a strange way, you realize the river crossing was a fitting metaphor for the entirety of the Oregon Trail experience. A plunge into uncertainty, a fight against nature's implacable forces, a trial that demands all of your courage and resilience to overcome. But overcome it you have, and now the promised land lies within reach. The months of preparation in independence, the searing heat of the Nebraska plains, the dizzying heights of the Rockies, the dust of the Platte River Road. It has all led to this moment. As the Snake River disappears behind a bend, you square your shoulders and set your sights firmly westward. The Oregon Trail has taken much, but at long last, it will give much in return. A new life, a new home, a future as wide and untamed as the frontier itself. So onward you roll, to embrace the hope that lies just over the next horizon. The days after the Snake River crossing pass in a determined blur, the land around you shifting and changing as you wind your way through the rugged expanse of the Blue Mountains. Gone are the barren alkali flats and dusty sagebrush plains of the previous weeks. Now you find yourself enveloped by the sweet scent of pine and the soft babble of clear-running streams. It's as if the very landscape is heralding your arrival in the fabled Oregon country. As you crest the final pass, an audible gasp ripples through the wagon train. There, stretching out before you like a verdant quilt, is the Willamette Valley in all its lush splendor. Rolling hills of emerald grass, majestic stands of Douglas fir, the glittering ribbon of the Willamette River winding through it all. It's a sight that brings tears to even the most stoic pioneer's eyes. After months of toil, hardship, and heartbreak, you've finally made it to the promised land. But as you begin the descent into the valley, the elation is tempered by a bittersweet realization. Yes, you've reached Oregon, but the challenges are far from over. The land may be fertile and bountiful, but it is also raw, untamed, and utterly unfamiliar. Building a new life here will require every ounce of grit and determination that got you through the trials of the trail. As the wagon train makes camp that night, the mood is a mix of joy, relief, and trepidation. Families huddle around flickering campfires, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames as they contemplate the uncertain future ahead. You overhear snatches of conversation, plans for land claims, the best spots for a cabin, what crops to plant come spring. But beneath the practicalities, there's an undercurrent of vulnerability, a sense of being unmoored in this strange new world. You feel it yourself as you sit with your own family beneath the star-strewn Oregon sky. The journey has changed all of you, in ways both tangible and ineffable. Your hands are calloused, your face weathered, your eyes older than your years. But more than that, the trail has forged an unbreakable bond between you, a shared history of triumph and tragedy that will forever tie you together. As you gaze out over the slumbering valley, you can't help but reflect on the incredible journey that brought you here. The lure of the frontier, the leap of faith in independence, the grueling slog across half a continent. It all led to this moment, this place, this new beginning. The Oregon Trail, in all its brutal glory, has shaped you, challenged you, and ultimately delivered you to the land of your dreams. But as you drift off to sleep that night, your last thoughts are not of the trail behind you, but of the road ahead. For tomorrow, the real work begins, the work of putting down roots, of building a community, of carving out a life in this untamed wilderness. It will be hard, yes, there will be setbacks and struggles, just as there were on the trail. But you know now that you have the strength, the resilience, to weather whatever comes. And so, as the embers of your campfire slowly fade to ash, you allow yourself to dream of the future, of golden waves of wheat rippling in the breeze, of a snug cabin filled with laughter and love, of generations to come who will call this valley home. The Oregon Trail has given you this chance, this beautiful blank slate, and you intend to make the most of it. In the morning, as the sun rises over the misty hills, you and your fellow pioneers will take your first steps into this new chapter. The wagon ruts may fade with time, but the legacy of the Oregon Trail will live on in the towns and cities that will soon sprout from this fertile soil. It will live on in the stories passed down through generations, tales of courage and sacrifice, of ordinary people who dared to risk everything for a dream. And it will live on in you, in the quiet strength and unshakable spirit that the trail has forged within you. For you are an Oregon pioneer now, tempered by the challenges of the frontier, ready to embrace all the possibilities that this new land has to offer. The Oregon Trail has left its mark on you, and now it's your turn to leave your mark on Oregon. As the first rays of dawn illuminate the valley, you rise to face the new day and the new life that awaits. With a deep breath and a heart full of hope, you set about the task of turning this rugged wilderness into a home. It's the start of a new journey, one that will be filled with its own trials and triumphs. But you are ready, thanks to the lessons of the trail, ready to build, to grow, to thrive in this place you fought so hard to reach. So let history remember the Oregon Trail, not just as a path, but as a crucible, a gauntlet that tested the mettle of a generation, and in doing so, shaped the very spirit of the American West. From the muddy banks of the Missouri to the emerald hills of the Willamette, this iconic journey has left an indelible mark on the landscape and the soul of a nation. And as you stand there in the golden light of an Oregon morning, you know that you too are part of that legacy, a living testament to the power of perseverance, the strength of the human spirit, and the enduring promise of the American dream. The Oregon Trail may be behind you, but its lessons, its memories, its impact, those will stay with you always, as constant as the Western Star that guided you here. So let us end our journey through history here, with you poised on the brink of a new adventure in a new land. For the story of the Oregon Trail is not just a tale of the past, but a living, breathing part of who we are as a people. A reminder of the challenges we've overcome, the dreams we've chased, and the unbreakable spirit that defines us. And as we drift off to sleep, let the echoes of this incredible journey follow us into our dreams, the creak of the wagons, the thunder of hoofbeats, the laughter and tears of those brave pioneers. For in the end, the Oregon Trail is more than just a chapter in America's history. It's a part of our shared story, a testament to the enduring power of hope, courage, and the indomitable human spirit. So let us rest now, with the memory of the trail winding through our minds like a ribbon of dreams. And in the morning, let us wake with a renewed appreciation for the challenges and triumphs of those who came before us, the pioneers who dared to forge a new path, and in doing so, helped shape the very fabric of this nation. The Oregon Trail may be a thing of the past, but its legacy lives on in the heart and soul of America, a reminder of who we are, where we've been, and all the possibilities that lie ahead. And so, as we close our eyes and drift off to sleep, let us carry that legacy with us always, a source of strength, inspiration, and hope for the journey ahead. We pick up our story at the great midpoint fortress of the Oregon Trail, Fort Laramie. After months of arduous travel across the barren plains and steep mountains, this bustling oasis on the banks of the Laramie River was a sight for weary eyes. Imagine the relief of the pioneers as they glimpsed the American flag fluttering above the wooden palisades, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer ringing out, repairing wagon wheels and shoeing oxen, the tantalizing smells of fresh bread and hot coffee wafting from the kitchens. For a brief moment, the comforts of civilization were restored. Fort Laramie was a place to rest, regroup, and resupply. But it was also a place of difficult decisions. With the worst of the journey still ahead, some pioneers had to reckon with whether they still had the stamina, the resources, and the will to press onward to Oregon. Tensions often ran high within the close confines of the fort. Soldiers and pioneers, mountain men and missionaries, all thrown together in an uneasy mix. Frayed nerves snapped. Fistfights broke out over card games. There's a story of one young man, a troublemaker, who finally pushed things too far. He thought the trail had made him tough, thought he could throw his weight around, but he picked the wrong fight, got on the wrong side of the wrong people. One morning, he was unceremoniously escorted out of the gates by a grim-faced posse, run out of Fort Laramie with a clear message not to show his face around there again. He slunk away down the trail, alone, his bravado shattered. For most, though, Fort Laramie was a place to take strength for the trials to come, to rest weary feet, fill bellies with something other than trail rations, to laugh and swap stories with other emigrants around the campfires, faces glowing in the flickering light. There's something about shared adversity that forges quick bonds. Together, these strangers turned comrades, prepared to embark on the second half of their epic journey. They knew the toughest mountains, the driest stretches, still lay ahead. But in that brief pause, that momentary reprieve at Fort Laramie, their hope was rekindled. With repairs made, supplies restocked, and spirits bolstered, they hitched up their oxen and rolled out of the fort, eyes fixed on the western horizon. The Willamette Valley was still hundreds of difficult miles away, but it shimmered like a mirage, lush and fertile in their mind's eye. Little did they know, the worst was still to come. Beyond Fort Laramie, a cruel spectre was waiting to descend on these wagon trains, more deadly than any other danger they had faced: disease. Unbeknownst to the emigrants, the very water they depended on would soon become a brutal killer. Contaminated water from streams and rivers was a constant hazard on the trail. It harbored bacteria and parasites that wreaked havoc on pioneer immune systems. The most dreaded of these illnesses was cholera, known to strike suddenly and lethally. The first sign was usually an intense thirst, followed by agonizing cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. Within hours, the afflicted would become severely dehydrated, their sunken eyes ringed with dark circles, their skin a telltale bluish tint. The terrible irony was that the more they tried to slake their raging thirst, the worse it got, their bodies flushing out vital fluids. Once cholera struck a wagon party, it could decimate their numbers with terrifying speed. There was no cure, no real treatment except to try to keep the patient hydrated, an almost impossible task. We can scarcely imagine the horror of watching a loved one succumb to this awful fate in a matter of hours, of having to bundle their wasted body in a blanket for a hasty burial in a shallow roadside grave, of wondering if you might be next. Some wagon parties lost over half their number to cholera. There were times the trail was lined with fresh burial mounds as far as the eye could see, like a grim procession marching alongside the ruts carved by wagon wheels. So many dreams cut short, so many families torn asunder. For those left behind, there was no time to properly grieve, no way to memorialize their loved ones, except perhaps to scratch a name and a date on a rough wooden marker. The stark law of the trail was to keep moving at all costs. Imagine the heavy, haunted silence that hung over a wagon party in the wake of a cholera outbreak. The empty spaces where vibrant souls had laughed, argued, toiled, and dreamed. Parents struggling to comfort heartbroken children, even as they grappled with their own unfathomable loss. It took a toll that went beyond the physical. For some, the light simply went out of their eyes, their spirits broken by this cruel twist of fate. Others clung fiercely to their faith, determined to trust in God's plan, even as they buried their dead in the unforgiving soil. As the shattered remnants of wagon parties rolled on, each one diminished by disease, the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Why? Why us? Why now? Why this terrible suffering? There were no answers on the trail, only the brute necessity of pushing onwards. With every mile, the survivors became bound ever closer by the depth of their shared tragedy. These terrible trials seared unbreakable bonds between the pioneers. Gradually, mercifully, the worst of the cholera outbreaks passed, but the fear of it lingered, an unseen passenger in every wagon. The sight of a rough wooden cross driven into the dry earth was a constant reminder of how quickly, how randomly, the reaper might strike. As the depleted wagon trains rolled on across the dusty plains, each sunrise brought a renewed sense of resolve, to cherish their loved ones, to savor each simple moment of beauty and rest, to remember the precious lives lost, to carry on in their memory. But the Oregon Trail was not done with them yet. Ahead lay the single most daunting obstacle of the entire journey: the Snake River crossing. This deceptively placid-looking waterway would prove the final trial for many an exhausted pioneer. The Snake River was too deep to ford, with a deceptively strong current. Wagon parties had to disassemble their wagons and float them piecemeal across on rickety rafts, roped together from logs. Oxen and horses had to be coaxed into the water to swim across, braving the chill and the current. It was a painstaking, nerve-wracking process. One slip, one miscalculation could spell disaster. Rafts overturned, spilling precious supplies into the murky depths. Cattle drowned, their exhausted bodies giving out mid-crossing. Many pioneers, too, weighed down by sodden clothing, got dragged under by the surging current. The snake claimed many lives, many dreams. Imagine the eerie stillness in a wagon camp the night after a disastrous river crossing. Shell-shocked survivors trying to regroup, to take stock of all they had lost in a few fateful minutes. The gaping absence of a father's booming laugh. The ghostly rustle of a lost sister's skirts. Orphaned children huddled together in the dark. In the aftermath, they had no choice but to press on with whatever they had left. To cling to each other and to their last shreds of hope as their wagons creaked and groaned over the final mountain ranges. The shattered wagon trains that limped into the lush Willamette Valley were shadows of their former selves. Gaunt, weary faces stared out from tattered wagon coverings. Children wore pinched, old expressions. The jaunty air of adventure long since replaced by the 1,000-yard stare of those who have endured the unendurable. And yet, as the towering firs and rumbling waterfalls of Oregon came into view, something shifted. Tears flowed, ragged cheers rang out, knees buckled and dropped to the mossy ground in prayer. They had made it. They had survived the hell of the Oregon Trail. The promised land was no longer a mirage, but solid, loamy earth beneath their feet. Of the thousands who had set out, full of hope and vigor, only a hardened fraction made it through. Tough as nails, lashed together by tragedy, forged in the crucible of the trail. These survivors would always carry the scars, the empty chairs at the table, the phantom pains of old injuries, the nightmares of drowning cattle, of shallow graves. But they would also carry an unshakable faith in themselves, in what they could overcome together. The pioneers who poured into Oregon in the early 1850s were a different breed from the fresh-faced greenhorns who had rolled out of Missouri. They knew how to face down fear, how to keep going when all seemed lost, and most of all, they knew the true worth of a helping hand, a kind word, a shared crust of bread when the chips were down. These hard-won lessons would shape the very bedrock of the Oregon Territory as it grew into a state. That grit, that resilience, that sense of community forged through hardship. These were the true legacies of the Oregon Trail. So, as you drift off tonight, spare a thought for the dreamers who risked it all on the trail, who faced the worst the wilderness could throw at them and came out the other side, unbowed, if not unbroken. Their story is the story of America itself, a dream pursued through fearsome adversity, whose price was paid in blood, sweat, and tears. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be sweeter than those of the brave pioneers whose wheels carved this country's destiny. And may you never take for granted the simple blessings they fought so hard to win. Reaching Fort Laramie in the height of summer was both a relief and a rude awakening for the weary pioneers. For many, this bustling outpost in the foothills of the Rockies marked the rough halfway point on their arduous westward journey. It was a chance to rest trail-worn bodies, repair battered wagons, and replenish dwindling supplies. But it was also a harsh reminder of just how far they still had to go. As the wagon trains rolled in, Fort Laramie transformed into a chaotic tent city practically overnight. The normally tranquil parade grounds swarmed with exhausted families setting up temporary camps. Hardened soldiers watched bemusedly as greenhorn pioneers dickered and bartered, trading away precious heirlooms for exorbitantly priced flour, salt pork, and coffee. The clamor of hundreds of voices, the whinny of horses and lowing of oxen, and the smoke of countless campfires rose over the adobe walls. But for all the commotion, there was an undercurrent of tension between the newcomers and the fort's rugged inhabitants. Fort Laramie may have been a beacon of civilization out in the wilderness, but it played by its own rules. Card sharps, liquor peddlers, and horse thieves plied their trades among the naive pilgrims, leading to heated confrontations and the occasional gunfight. The hard-bitten soldiers had little patience for greenhorns who thought they were above the law of the frontier. One such unlucky soul was a young man by the name of Jake Thompson. Brash, boastful, and quick to take offense, Jake had been a thorn in the side of his wagon train since they set off from Independence. He shirked his duties, picked fights with the other men, and made crude advances on the women folk. The train's leader had been looking for an excuse to be rid of him, and Fort Laramie would give him the perfect opportunity. It didn't take long for Jake to find trouble. After a few too many nips of rock-gut whiskey, he got into a heated argument with a grizzled fur trapper over a card game. Fists flew, tables were overturned, and the whole sordid affair spilled out into the parade ground. In his drunken state, Jake made the mistake of taking a wild swing at a cavalry officer who tried to break up the fight. That was all the excuse the soldiers needed. They pounced on Jake, beating him senseless with rifle butts and dragging him off to the stockade. The next morning, bruised and bloodied, he was unceremoniously thrown out of the fort's gates with a stern warning never to return. His wagon master flatly refused to let him rejoin the train, tossing his meager belongings out into the dirt. Jake Thompson had finally worn out his welcome. With no horse, no supplies, and 800 miles of wilderness ahead of him, his fate was as good as sealed. For the rest of the pioneers, the incident was a sobering reminder that there could be no tolerance for troublemakers on the trail. With the toughest part of the journey still to come, the only way they would survive was by looking out for each other. As the wagon trains rolled out of Fort Laramie, leaving a chastened Jake in their dust, a grim determination settled over the company. The Rockies loomed on the horizon, their snow-capped peaks a daunting yet alluring sight. There could be no turning back now. As much as Fort Laramie represented a respite, it also forced upon the pioneers a moment of reckoning. With the most harrowing leg of the journey ahead, each man, woman, and child had to look deep within themselves and decide if they had the grit to press onward. Practically every emigrant guidebook and trail journal had warned them of the perils to come. The blistering alkali flats, the treacherous mountain passes, the parched desert stretches with nary a drop to drink. It would take every ounce of strength, courage, and luck to make it through. Some decided they simply weren't cut out for the hardships ahead. A few wagon loads of weary, disillusioned families turned around at Fort Laramie, preferring to retrace the 800 miles back to their old lives in the east, rather than risk the great unknown of the west. Others sought to improve their odds by pooling their resources, combining their wagons and livestock with those of other families to form larger, stronger traveling units. Better to cast one's lot with strangers than to go it alone in hostile country. But for the vast majority, there was no question of quitting, even if the way forward was more daunting than ever. These hardy souls had not come this far, endured this much, to be cowed by a few mountains and deserts. The verdant promised land of Oregon still beckoned, and they would reach it or perish in the attempt. And so, with a mixture of anxiety and resolve, the wagon trains bid farewell to the relative safety of Fort Laramie and ventured forth into the wild. Even for the most stout-hearted pioneer, the desolation of the trail beyond Fort Laramie was enough to shake one's resolve. Almost immediately, the vibrant green prairies gave way to the desiccated badlands of Wyoming, a seemingly endless expanse of dusty flats, naked buttes, and bizarre rock formations. It was a landscape utterly inimical to human habitation, offering precious little in the way of sustenance or comfort. The most disheartening sight of all was the Platte River, the emigrants' constant companion since crossing the Kansas River hundreds of miles ago. Where once it had flowed wide, swift and clear, now it had shriveled into a sluggish, brackish stream, its waters barely fit for livestock, let alone parched human throats. The cottonwoods and willows that lined its banks grew ragged and sparse, offering scant shade from the relentless sun overhead. To make matters worse, the intense heat and aridity took a brutal toll on the pioneers' draft animals. Oxen that had already hauled the wagons 1,000 miles grew gaunt and listless, their hooves cracked and split by miles of tramping over sun-baked earth and jagged rocks. Horses fared little better, many falling prey to the dreaded alkali poisoning as they grazed on tainted grass along the trail. With each passing mile, it became a more common sight to see a dead or dying beast left by the wayside, its carcass picked over by opportunistic coyotes and vultures. For the emigrants, there was little to do but press grimly onward, rationing their water and watching their livestock waste away before their eyes. Many took to walking alongside the wagons to spare the teams, their boots wearing through and clothes rotting off their backs. Dust was their constant companion, invading eyes, ears, nose, and throat, turning food gritty and sleep elusive. The shimmering heat played tricks on the eyes, conjuring mirages of lakes and rivers that dissolved upon approach into nothing but more cruel desert. Yet through all the hardships, the pioneers endured. They pushed themselves to the brink of human endurance, and then pushed a little harder, sustained by sheer grit and the stubborn belief that a better life lay just over the horizon. When water ran low, they dug down into the dry stream beds to fill their barrels with what muddy liquid they could find. When the sun beat down mercilessly, they soaked their bonnets and hats in any damp patch of ground to stave off heat stroke. And when the bone weariness threatened to overwhelm them, they took heart from small acts of kindness and camaraderie among the company. Perhaps no one embodied this spirit of resilience more than young Sarah and Ethan Cooper. Orphaned on the trail when cholera claimed their parents, the brother and sister duo had been taken in by a neighbouring family in the wagon train. Though barely in their teens, Sarah and Ethan pulled their weight, and then some, rising before dawn to cook breakfast, collecting buffalo chips for fuel throughout the day, and staying up late to help repair torn harnesses and wagon wheels. At night, huddled together under a threadbare blanket, they would talk in whispers about the farm they would someday have in Oregon, with rich soil, a snug cabin, and a clear stream for fishing. No matter how grim things got, they never let go of that dream. And their unwavering optimism had a way of lifting the spirits of all those around them, a reminder that hope could flourish, even in this unforgiving wilderness. So the wagon train limped onward, mile by grueling mile, across the sun-scorched barrens of the Platte River Road. The Blue Mountains shimmered on the far horizon like an impossible mirage, a wall of granite and ponderosa pine standing between the emigrants and their promised land. To reach them would take a feat of sheer human gumption and perseverance. But if any group was up to the challenge, it was this stalwart band of pioneers, for they knew that the Oregon Trail would demand nothing less than everything they had, and they were prepared to give it. Cholera swept through wagon trains like an invisible assassin, striking suddenly and showing no mercy. The telltale symptoms, diarrhea, vomiting, sunken eyes, instilled dread in the hearts of pioneers. In the 1850s, one fateful year saw the trail nearly grind to a halt as thousands fell ill. Imagine the despair of a mother watching her child slowly fade, powerless to help. Or the grim task of a husband burying his young wife in a shallow grave, knowing he must press on without her. Doctors were scarce on the trail, and even if one was present, the treatments of the day, like bleeding or mercury pills, often did more harm than good. The very land seemed to conspire against the emigrants. In the dry stretches, good water was hard to come by. Thirsty pioneers would drink from stagnant pools or wells contaminated by the waste of those who had passed before. And so the sickness spread, leaping from one wagon to the next. A Massachusetts family, the Bixbys, learned this hard truth in the cruelest way. The eldest daughter, Sarah, was the first to succumb, struck down in the night. They buried her at dawn beside the Platte River. 2 days later, both little ones were gone as well. The parents were left to stumble on in a daze of grief. In the face of such loss, pioneers clung to their faith and to each other. They held makeshift trailside services, tears mingling with the dust on their cheeks. Prayers and hymns drifted over the vast open country. As one diarist wrote, "We have no other solace out here in this desolate land." Some took solace in simple acts of humanity. There are accounts of emigrants halting their journeys to nurse the sick from other wagon trains. Women would stay up all night tending to the afflicted, even while their own families waited. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of compassion could not be extinguished. Yet as much as they mourned, the pioneers knew they had to keep moving. With heavy hearts, they would bury their dead, often marking graves with only a rough wooden cross or pile of stones. They had to trust that God would watch over the souls laid to rest in the wild. The Oregon Trail was a crucible that tested the pioneers physically, mentally, and spiritually. For every joyful reunion in Oregon, there were untold stories of loss along the way. Every mile traversed was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. After months of toil and tragedy, the emigrants' toughest trial lay ahead: the daunting crossing of the Snake River. This formidable waterway, with its strong currents and steep banks, was a fearsome sight for weary travelers. Many chose to hire native guides or pay for risky ferries rather than brave the crossing on their own. But even these weren't foolproof. In 1854, a ferry near Fort Boise capsized, claiming 18 lives. Most victims weren't even recovered for burial. Imagine the somber mood that would descend over a wagon train in the wake of such a catastrophe. The usual sounds of chatter, pots clanking, children playing, all replaced by an eerie, mournful quiet. A pall that even the steady thud of hooves and creak of wheels couldn't lift. For those who did muster the courage to ford the river, it was an ordeal they'd not soon forget. Wagons would be slowly floated across, some buoyed with crude rafts or emptied of their contents. Animals would have to swim alongside. All it took was one slip, one hole, and precious cargo could be lost to the roiling waters. William Newby, a pioneer of 1843, vividly recounted the terror. "My horses were soon swimming, and the current so swift that it took them far down the river. The wagon filled with water but did not sink. I had my hands full to keep my team from drowning and my family from a watery grave." Even after a successful crossing, the shaken emigrants had to take stock of what the river had taken from them. Soaked belongings, ruined provisions, drowned livestock. Each loss was a fresh wound to people already battered by the harrowing journey. Yet through some miracle of the human spirit, they carried on. Pressing forward over the parched, unforgiving terrain, eyes fixed on the western horizon. Driven by dreams, or perhaps by the knowledge that they had nowhere to turn back to. For the pioneers, to cross the Snake was to confront their own mortality, their fragility in the face of nature's might. It was a passage through shadow, a strange sort of baptism from which they emerged forever changed. And still the wagons rolled, ever closer to the promised land. The Blue Mountains, last great barrier between the emigrants and their Eden, loomed in the distance. Footsore and bone-weary, the pilgrims rallied for the final push. Hope crested as they ascended into the cool forested peaks. The scent of pine a balm after months of dust and sage. Starvation and sickness had winnowed their numbers, but the survivors were lean, hardened, tempered by the crucible of the trail. They'd learned to savor small joys and simple pleasures, the giggle of a child chasing a butterfly, the sweet tartness of a wild blackberry, a welcome change from the bland rations. At night, fiddle tunes around the campfire, a brief return to the civilized comforts they'd left behind. But the Blue Mountains weren't to be underestimated. The trail turned steep and narrow, a gauntlet of boulders and precipitous drops. Wagons groaned under the strain, threatening to splinter apart. Livestock, worn to mere hide and bone, struggled on the inclines. More than one diarist described a gut-churning moment at cliff's edge, wondering if a single misstep would send them plummeting. It would have been a cruel fate indeed, to come so close to journey's end, only to have it snatched away. At last, after a tortuous passage, the emigrants crested the final pass and gazed down in wonder. There, unfurled before them, was the lush splendor of the Willamette Valley. Virgin soil as far as the eye could see, verdant and dew-kissed, ripe with promise. Tears flowed freely as it sank in that they'd made it, that Oregon was no longer a fever dream, but a reality they could run their hands through. The sheer improbability of their survival. The fact that they'd traversed half a continent by sheer grit and force of will began to register. Over a crackling campfire on that last night on the trail, the pioneers must have felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. Gratitude to the Almighty for seeing them through. Grief for the loved ones lost along the way, bones forever bleaching on the plains. And anticipation for the new lives waiting just over the horizon. Sleep would not have come easy with their hearts and minds awhirl. But there was comfort in the knowledge that the morrow would dawn on a world of their own making. That after the trials of the trail, they'd earned a fresh start, a chance to put down roots and flourish. As wagons rumbled down from the mountains, they fanned out, dispersing across the fertile valley. Some staked claims in the rolling foothills. Others pressed on to Oregon City, the end of the line. Everywhere were scenes of jubilation, families reunited, friends embracing, whoops of joy carried on the breeze. Yet for most, the elation was tempered with sober realities. They'd made it, but just barely. Most stepped into this new life with little more than the tattered clothes on their backs and a few cherished heirlooms. Everything would have to be built from scratch: homes, farms, communities. There were bittersweet endings too. Some partnerships forged on the trail dissolved as settlers scattered to chase their individual ambitions. Wagon trains that had been as tight-knit as family found themselves splintering. Ties slowly loosening until they were connected only by the gossamer threads of memory. Still, the pioneers shouldered their burdens with the same quiet resolve that had carried them 2,000 miles. They felled trees and raised barns, ploughed fields and planted crops. One by one, dirt floor cabins and tidy farmhouses began to dot the landscape. It must have been a surreal feeling to stand on one's own plot of land, hard-won through months of toil and sacrifice, to watch the sun set over rolling hills, knowing that this was now home, not just in name but in blood, sweat, and tears. The Oregon Trail left an indelible mark on the land and on the people who braved its challenges. Even today, the faint traces of wagon ruts wind through the sage and grasslands, a haunting reminder of the thousands of souls who risked everything on the promise of a better tomorrow. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of the American experience. It echoes in our notions of rugged individualism, in our idealization of the pioneer spirit. We see it in our belief in manifest destiny, that ancestral conviction that this land was ours for the taking. But perhaps most enduring is the lesson of resilience in the face of adversity, of the indomitable nature of hope, that force that propels us ever forward, even through the darkest of nights. In their struggles and their triumphs, the pioneers embodied that quintessential American creed, that with enough grit and determination, any obstacle can be overcome. As you drift off to sleep, take a moment to marvel at their courage, their fortitude, their sheer force of will. Imagine the creaking of wagons, the lowing of oxen, the soft murmur of voices around a flickering campfire. Let the vastness of the frontier fill your mind's eye, a canvas of infinite possibility. And if you find yourself facing your own hardships, your own steep and rocky trails, draw strength from their example. Remember that you too are made of stern stuff, that you carry within you that same ember of resilience. The Oregon Trail may be consigned to history, but its spirit lives on, in the dreams we chase, the challenges we overcome, the futures we forge. So take heart, dear listener, and know that you are part of a grand tradition, a lineage of dreamers and doers stretching back to those long ago wagon trains. As you slip into slumber, let the tale of the Oregon Trail be a reminder that no matter how daunting the journey, there's always hope on the horizon. And with each new dawn, we are given the chance to steer our wagons towards a brighter tomorrow. From all of us here, Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this bedtime story, we'd be most grateful if you could like and subscribe. Consider it your way of throwing an extra sack of flour in our wagon. Until our next adventure, may your trails be smooth, your burdens light, and your dreams as wide as the western sky. Good night.